3 days after my father died, I walked into the kitchen at 10:30 in the morning and found my husband drinking coffee in his sweatpants. I stopped with one hand still on the doorway. "Why are you home?" Mark looked up from his laptop. "Morning to you too. It's Wednesday. I know what day it is." For half a second I thought maybe he'd taken bereavement leave. Dad's funeral wasn't until Friday, and I'd spent most of that morning arguing with the florist about whether Walter Hale, a man who considered decorative pillows a personal insult, would have wanted an arrangement called Heavenly Garden. Then I noticed Mark's company phone wasn't on the counter. Did something happen at work? He closed the laptop. I quit. I actually looked behind me as if there might be another husband in the room who could explain what mine had just said. I resigned. When yesterday. Yesterday he took a sip of coffee. "Claire, don't make it sound like I joined a cult. Normally that would have made me laugh." Mark had always been good at slipping humor into uncomfortable conversations. For 22 years it had gotten him out of more trouble than either of us would probably admit. That morning it didn't. "Why would you quit your job yesterday?" He leaned back. "Because I don't see the point anymore. The point is generally the paycheck. You know what I mean?" "No, I don't." He studied my face for a moment, then said it as casually as if he'd decided we didn't need cable anymore. "Why keep working? Your inheritance is enough for both of us." I just stared at him. Dad had been dead 72 hours. I still had his last voicemail on my phone because I couldn't bring myself to delete it. There were sympathy cards stacked beside the toaster. His obituary was open on my iPad, and my husband had apparently already retired. What inheritance? Mark gave me a look. "Come on, Claire, no. Tell me." "Your dad sold Hale Mechanical for millions. His house is paid off. He had investments. He barely spent money." "How much do you think I'm getting?" "I don't know exactly." "Then how do you know it's enough for you to quit working?" He hesitated. That hesitation bothered me more than the answer. "Well, even conservatively, it's got to be a few million." I remember thinking, conservatively, he'd done math. I hadn't even done math. I knew Dad was comfortable. I knew he'd sold his commercial HVAC company 6 years earlier, but we'd never discussed what I'd inherit. Dad talked more freely about his cholesterol than his finances, and that's saying something. Mark reached for my hand. "Look, I've worked since I was 22. I'm 55. 33 years of quotas, airports, regional meetings, clients calling me on Sunday because apparently air filters are a national emergency. Maybe we finally get to enjoy our lives." There was something in that I understood. Mark had been tired for years. But understanding why somebody does something doesn't automatically make the thing reasonable. "You quit without talking to me." "I knew you'd worry." "That isn't a defense. I was going to tell you. You did tell me, after you quit." He sighed. "Can we not do this right now?" I almost laughed. Apparently, right now was an inappropriate time to discuss the decision he'd made because my father had just died. That evening, Mark's mother and sister came over. My mother-in-law brought lasagna. His sister brought wine. For the first 20 minutes, everything felt almost normal. Then Mark started spending Dad's money. His mother, Diane, was complaining about another rent increase when Mark said, "Don't worry about it, Mom. Once everything clears, I'll buy you a house." I looked up. Diane blinked. "Mark, I'm serious." "Oh, honey, I couldn't let you do that." Then without much of a pause, she added, "There are some nice little ranches near Westerville." That was when I realized this conversation might not be entirely new. His sister, Melissa, smiled. "Look at Mom. She already has a zip code." Diane waved her off. "I've looked. That doesn't mean anything." Mark laughed. Then he turned to Melissa. "And we'll get you straightened out, too." She frowned. "What does that mean?" "Your debt. The business stuff. I'll give you 200 grand. Clean slate." Melissa put down her fork. "Are you serious?" "Absolutely." She got up and hugged him. I sat there holding my water glass. Nobody had asked me anything. Not how I was doing. Not what Dad's estate looked like. Not what I might want to do with whatever he had left me. They had moved directly to distribution. "Mark." He looked at me. "What Dad hasn't even been buried." The table went quiet. His smile disappeared. Claire, that's not what this is. What is it I'm talking about taking care of family? I looked from him to his mother, then to his sister. Whose family? Diane immediately looked down. Melissa sat back in her chair. Mark's jaw tightened. That's unnecessary. So was promising $200,000 that nobody asked me about. Melissa raised both hands. I don't want to be in the middle of this. That was an interesting statement from someone who'd accepted $200,000 approximately 40 seconds earlier. I didn't say it. That was something I was very good at back then, not saying the thing that would make an uncomfortable moment worse. After they left, Mark followed me into the kitchen while I wrapped the leftover lasagna. You embarrassed my mother. I embarrassed your mother. She already feels uncomfortable accepting help. She seemed to recover. Claire. I put the foil down. You had no right to promise either of them anything. We're married. What does that have to do with promising Melissa $200,000? He rubbed his forehead. If your dad left you what I think he did, we're talking about more money than we'll ever need. That still doesn't answer me. Because you're turning this into something it isn't. What is it then? He gave a tired little laugh. Claire, there isn't going to be your money and my money. We're set. I didn't answer. Maybe because I was tired. Maybe because some part of me was doing what I'd done for years, deciding whether this was really worth a fight. Mark had always been generous, sometimes with things that weren't entirely his. He'd once loaned my SUV to Melissa for 4 days and told me afterward. When his mother's water heater died, he'd promised we'd cover it before mentioning it to me. He volunteered our house for Thanksgiving so regularly that one year I found out because Diane asked what time she should bring the rolls. None of those things had seemed enormous. Marriage is full of small irritations. If you've been married long enough, you learn that not every hill deserves a flag planted on top of it. At least that's what I'd always told myself. The next morning my phone rang while I was standing in Dad's bedroom trying to decide which suit he should be buried in. Claire. It's Samuel Green, Dad's attorney. We exchanged the usual awkward condolences. Then Samuel said, there are several estate documents Walter wanted me to go through with you. Could you come in tomorrow morning, of course? Mark can come with me? There was a pause. Not a long one. Long enough. Actually, Samuel said, your father specifically requested that our first meeting be with you alone. I looked through Dad's bedroom doorway toward the living room. Mark was sitting on the couch with his laptop open. On the screen was a used boat listing, and for the first time since Dad died, I wondered what my father had known that I didn't. Samuel Green's office was on the 4th floor of an older brick building downtown, the kind of place with narrow hallways and a directory in the lobby that looked like it had survived 3 mayors. I'd been there twice before with Dad, once when Mom died and once when Dad sold the company. Neither memory made me eager to go back. Samuel met me at the door himself. Claire, hi Samuel. He shook my hand, then seemed to think better of the formality and gave my shoulder a brief squeeze. I'm sorry about Walter. Thank you. He led me into his office. There was a legal pad waiting on the table, along with a bottle of water and a box of tissues positioned discreetly off to one side. I noticed the tissues and decided immediately that I wasn't going to need them. Grief makes you competitive about ridiculous things. Samuel sat across from me. For a few minutes we talked about the funeral, the death certificate, the house, ordinary estate things. Then he closed the folder in front of him. Before we get into numbers, there's something Walter wanted me to discuss with you. Okay. Did Mark ever tell you that he came to see your father without you? That wasn't remotely the question I'd expected. Mark, yes. When? About 8 months ago. I shook my head. No. Samuel nodded as if that answer confirmed something. He contacted Walter more than once. There was an in-person conversation, a later phone call, and eventually an email. What about your father's estate? I sat back. My husband discussed my father's estate with him. Walter asked me to be careful about how I characterize the conversations. Mark wasn't threatening him. He wasn't attempting anything illegal. That almost made it worse. What was he doing? Samuel opened another folder. He was planning. He slid a single sheet of paper toward me. It was a copy of a letter in Dad's handwriting. I recognized the blocky capital letters immediately. Dad wrote like every note might someday be submitted as evidence. Samuel said Walter authorized me to give this to you after his death. I read the first few lines. Dad wrote that Mark had come by one afternoon and started talking about retirement. Nothing unusual at first. Mark had complained about travel and sales quotas plenty of times. Then I reached one paragraph and stopped. Dad had written down the exchange almost word for word. Mark had said, "Once Claire inherits, I can finally stop working." Dad had answered, "Claire inherits." And Mark had laughed. "Come on, Walter. We're married." I read it twice. Samuel waited. "That bothered him?" I asked. "Yes. Why didn't he say something to me? We'll get to that." I looked back at the page. What bothered me was how perfectly it matched what Mark had said in our kitchen. There isn't going to be your money and my money. Apparently that idea hadn't arrived 3 days after Dad died. It had been there before. Samuel opened the estate folder. "Your father did very well when he sold Hale Mechanical. He invested conservatively afterward. After charitable gifts, estate expenses, and the other provisions in his plan, the assets intended primarily for you are currently valued at approximately $3.8 million, not including the house." I don't remember having some dramatic reaction. Mostly I thought Mark wasn't far off. And I hated that thought. Samuel continued. "The majority of those assets are held in a trust Walter established before his death. A trust for me. Yes, you're the beneficiary." What does that mean in practical terms? It means you're financially secure. The trust can provide income and distributions for housing, health expenses, retirement planning, and your general financial welfare. This isn't designed to put you on an allowance. Good, because I'm 52. Samuel smiled slightly. Walter made essentially the same point. That sounded like Dad. "The unusual part," Samuel continued, "is that for the first 5 years, extraordinary distributions of principal require approval from an independent corporate trustee." Extraordinary meaning. A large gift to another person would certainly qualify. A major speculative investment might. Putting several $100,000 into a relative's business would. I stared at him. So Dad put somebody between me and the money, for certain decisions temporarily. Because of Mark, Samuel took his time answering. Partly because Walter was concerned about pressure. That irritated me, not at Samuel, at Dad. I'm not 12 years old. No, he could have talked to me. Yes. Instead, he built a financial fence around me. Samuel leaned back. "Would you like to know how Walter explained it?" I nodded. He pointed to the second page of Dad's letter. Dad wrote that he didn't know whether Mark would ever actually pressure me. He said Mark had been a good husband in plenty of ways, and that 22 years of marriage meant more than one conversation about money. Then came a line that sounded so much like my father I could practically hear him clearing his throat before saying it. "I don't want to leave Claire my opinion of her husband along with my money." I stopped there, Samuel said quietly. "He didn't want you spending his last months defending Mark to him. That one hurt. Because Dad knew me, I probably would have done exactly that." "He wasn't trying to make a decision about your marriage," Samuel said. "He wanted to make sure nobody could rush you into one about the money." I finally reached for one of those tissues I'd decided I wasn't going to need. Samuel had the decency not to notice. When I got home, Mark was in the kitchen. He'd showered and changed, which somehow made me feel better until his first word was, "So I put my purse down." So what? He gave me an impatient look. "Claire." "What did Green say?" "There's a trust." His expression changed immediately. How much? I looked at him. He corrected himself. "I mean, what are the terms?" "No." "You meant how much." "Okay, fine. How much? I'm not discussing numbers today." "Why?" "Because I buried my father this morning." "Mark." That stopped him for maybe 3 seconds. Then he asked, "How long until the trust pays out?" "It doesn't work like that." "What does that mean?" I explained the basics, not everything, just enough. Mark paced once across the kitchen. "So we need approval to use our own money, my inheritance. He turned. Seriously, that's what it is. Can we borrow against it? I don't know. Did you ask? No. He exhaled sharply. Claire, I already quit. There it was. Not I made a mistake. Not I should have talked to you. I already quit. As if his decision had created an invoice I was now responsible for paying. That night I went to bed early. Sometime after 1 I woke up thirsty and headed downstairs. I heard Mark before I reached the bottom. He was in the den speaking quietly on his phone. No, don't panic. I stopped. A pause. Then, the money exists. It's just tied up. Melissa. I knew from the tone. Mark lowered his voice further. I'll figure it out. Another pause. Then he said something I can still hear exactly as he said it. Claire will come around. I stood halfway down the staircase in the dark. Normally I would have walked in. I would have demanded to know what he meant. We would have argued until 2 in the morning and eventually one of us would have apologized just to end it. Instead, I turned around and went back upstairs. Because for once I didn't want Mark to know what I knew. I wanted to hear what he said when he thought I wasn't listening. The next morning I made coffee and asked Mark what he'd promised everybody. Not angrily. That seemed to bother him more. He was standing at the counter spreading peanut butter on toast when I said, "Besides the house for your mother and the money for Melissa, what else?" He stopped. What? What else have you planned, Claire? It's 7 in the morning. I know. He put the knife down. Are we really starting this again? I don't think we ever finished it. He stared at me for a moment, then pulled out a chair. All right, what do you want to know? Everything. Mark leaned back and crossed his arms. He said he'd been thinking about a lake place. Nothing ridiculous, according to him. Maybe somewhere near Buckeye Lake, close enough to use on weekends. He wanted to invest enough that we could live comfortably without touching much principal. He wanted to help his mother, help Melissa, travel, maybe spend January and February somewhere warm. Listening to him was strange because none of those things sounded terrible by themselves. I'd complained about Ohio winters for 20 years. I liked lakes. I wanted Diane to be secure. I didn't enjoy watching Melissa struggle. The problem was that Mark had built an entire future for us without once asking whether I wanted to live in it. Anything else? No. You sure? Yes. I took a sip of coffee. When did you quit? I told you. Tuesday. No. When did you actually resign? He looked toward the window. That was enough. Mark. The morning after your dad died. I set my mug down. Dad died late Sunday night. So, Monday morning, yes. You called your boss Monday morning and quit. I sent the resignation in Monday morning. We'd already discussed it. I caught that. We, my boss and me. Already discussed what Mark rubbed his face. Me leaving. When a few weeks ago. For a second, neither of us spoke. Dad was still alive. Claire, you were already talking about retiring while my father was still alive. I was talking about options, based on what he stood. Don't do this. Do what make it ugly. I almost couldn't believe that one. I'm not making anything ugly. I'm asking you a question. You're making it sound like I was sitting around waiting for Walter to die. Were you? No. The answer came fast enough that I believed him. But then he added, your dad was 79. He was sick. We all knew what was coming. I stared at him. Mark immediately realized how it sounded. That's not what I meant. Then help me out. He walked to the sink, then turned around. I've worked 33 years, Claire. 33. I've missed birthdays because some distributor in Cleveland couldn't wait until Monday. I've spent half my life in Hampton Inns eating scrambled eggs off paper plates. I'm tired. I know you're tired. Do you? Yes. Because your father got to sell his company and retire before 60. He had choices. There was something in his voice I'd heard before but never paid much attention to. Resentment. Not really toward Dad. Toward what Dad represented. I don't own a company, Mark continued. I don't have some huge retirement package. So when it became obvious we'd have enough, Baiksa. He closed his eyes. Here we go again. No. Answer me. When did my father's estate become your retirement account? He grabbed his keys. I can't talk to you when you're like this. That almost made me smile. He was unemployed. I had no idea where he was storming off to, but apparently he had somewhere to be. I didn't stop him. Over the next 2 days I started discovering how far his plans had gone. First came an email on our shared household account from a real estate agent thanking us for our interest in a lake property. I called. Mark had put down a refundable $5,000 deposit from our joint checking account. That evening, Diane called and casually mentioned she'd told her landlord she probably wouldn't renew her lease when it came up in 4 months. Then Melissa called. She wanted to know whether I had any idea when things might clear. What things? There was a pause. You know, the estate. Why? Another pause. I've been talking to one of my creditors, and Mark said I shouldn't agree to a long repayment plan if I'm going to be able to settle it soon. I sat at my desk staring at the wall. Mark hadn't merely made promises. People had started making decisions based on them. When he came home, I told him about both calls. He didn't look particularly alarmed. We'll sort it out. You told Melissa to stop negotiating her debt. I told her not to lock herself into something stupid. And your mother thinks she's moving. She probably is. Mark, you didn't just spend money we don't have. You changed other people's lives with it. We do have it. I looked at him. I have it. His face hardened. There it is. There, what is your money? Yes. You've never talked like this before. Because you've never promised away hundreds of thousands of dollars I inherited from my dead father before. He shook his head. Walter really got what he wanted with that trust. That did it. Don't blame my father for the fact that you quit your job. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. The next morning I called Samuel. I need to know something, I told him. Was that conversation with Dad the only time Mark talked about the estate? Samuel was quiet? No. So I went back downtown. This time there were no tissues on the table. Or maybe there were, and I just didn't notice them. Samuel opened a file. Walter authorized the release of this material to you after his death. I want to be clear about that. He slid several printed pages toward me. The first page had a title. Hale Bennett Family Investment Plan. I actually gave a little laugh. Not because it was funny. Because my husband had apparently given my father's death a business plan title. I turned the page. There were estimated investment returns. A proposed lake property, housing assistance for Diane, a section labeled Melissa Business Debt Resolution, $200,000 to $250,000, then retirement projections for Mark. I kept reading. Dad's estimated estate value appeared in 3 separate places. So did my name. Claire's expected inheritance, Claire's assets, Claire's projected investment income. I turned back to the first page. What's the date? Samuel didn't answer. He didn't need to. It was right there in the upper corner. 11 months before Dad died. I sat back. 11 months. Not 3 days after. Not grief, not panic, not some stupid decision made by an exhausted man after a funeral. Mark had been designing this life while Dad was still going to the hardware store, complaining about property taxes, and calling me every Sunday to ask why I hadn't checked the oil in my car. I went through the pages again. Slower this time. Then something struck me. Samuel. Yes, there's nothing here about what I wanted. He didn't say anything. There wasn't a section about whether I wanted to retire. Nothing about my plans. Nothing about what I might want to do for Emily. Nothing about charities Dad cared about. Nothing about keeping the money invested. I was everywhere in those pages, and somehow I wasn't in them at all. Samuel finally asked, "Are you all right?" "No." It was the easiest answer I'd given all week. Then I closed the folder. But I finally understand why Dad was worried. Before I left, I told Samuel one thing clearly. I don't want any of the inheritance transferred into our joint accounts. Not checking savings, investments, property, nothing. We can make sure everything is handled carefully. And I'm not requesting any large distributions. Samuel nodded. For now, I thought about that. For anything Mark promised. That evening, Mark was waiting for me in the kitchen. Did you talk to the trustee? Yes. He straightened. And I'm not requesting the money. His expression changed. Any of it. Not for your mother's house, not for Melissa, not for the lake place. He stared at me. For the first time since Dad died, Mark didn't look irritated. He didn't look offended. He looked scared. And that was when I realized something else. Until that moment, he'd never actually believed I might say no. Mark didn't speak to me for the rest of that evening, not exactly. He asked whether I'd fed the dog. He told me the dishwasher was clean. At 9:30, he stood in the doorway of the den and said, "I'm going to bed." We were apparently still capable of running a household. We just couldn't discuss the fact that he'd retired on money he didn't control. The next morning, he called his former boss. I wasn't trying to listen. Our house simply wasn't big enough for a 55-year-old man to have a private career crisis in the kitchen. "I'm not asking you to pretend I never resigned," Mark said. "I'm asking whether there's any way to reverse it." A long silence. "I understand." Another silence. "Yeah, of course." When he hung up, he stayed at the table. "What did he say?" I asked. My position's already been offered to Greg. I knew Greg. Mark had complained about him for 6 years. That was fast. Apparently, Greg doesn't need 3 weeks to make a decision. I let that go. Mark looked at me. "They may have something else later." "Okay. Probably less money." "Okay." He gave a humorless laugh. "You don't have to sound so devastated. What do you want me to say I don't know? Maybe that we'll figure this out together." I put my coffee down. We can figure out what happens next together. We cannot pretend quitting was a decision we made together. That distinction became the argument underneath every argument we had for the next week. Mark wanted me to request enough from the trust to replace 2 years of his salary while he figured out what he wanted to do. I said no. I wasn't threatening to stop paying the mortgage or groceries. I had my income from the physical therapy office, my own savings, and we'd always shared household expenses. What I wouldn't do was turn Dad's estate into severance pay for a resignation I hadn't known about. Then Mark's mother and sister came over. They called it talking. Family has a remarkable number of gentle words for situations that are not gentle, Melissa started. "Mark told us you're not requesting any distributions." I looked at him. He stared at the floor. "That's correct." Melissa shifted on the couch. "I just wish I'd known before." "Before what?" "Before I changed things with my creditors." "I didn't tell you to change anything." "No." "Mark did." "Then Mark owes you an apology." She frowned. "He's your husband, Claire." "Exactly. My husband, not my father's executor." Diane stepped in before Melissa could answer. "Let's not make this uglier than it needs to be." That phrase again. Apparently asking people not to spend my inheritance was what kept making everything ugly. Diane's approach was different. She didn't talk about entitlement. She talked about rent. Her lease had gone up twice in 3 years. She worried about another increase. She was 76 and tired of wondering whether she'd still be able to afford the same place at 80. And here's the part that would have been easier if I'd hated her. I didn't. Diane had driven me to the hospital when Emily was born because Mark was 2 counties away on a sales call. She'd sat beside me during my mother's chemotherapy. She made a ridiculous cranberry salad every Thanksgiving because Emily loved it. People are inconvenient that way. They can hurt you without erasing every decent thing they did before. After they left, I found myself thinking about that house. Not the one Mark had promised her. Just a small condo, something safe, something she could manage. 2 days later, I sat in Samuel's office and surprised him. What if I wanted to buy Diane a place? Samuel took off his glasses. "Do you? I might. That's different from whether you can. I know. We talked numbers. Something around $225,000 or $250,000 could buy a modest condo in an area she liked. It would require trustee approval, but Samuel thought a carefully structured request could be considered. Then he asked me one question. "Is this what you want, Claire?" I didn't answer immediately. I don't want her scared about housing. That wasn't my question. Lawyers can be irritatingly precise when they're good at their jobs. I don't know. Then don't submit anything today. So I didn't. And thank God for that. Diane came over the following afternoon. She didn't even take off her coat. "Mark said you talked to Samuel." I glanced toward the den. Mark wasn't there. He told you that. He said you might be reconsidering. I was thinking about some options. Her face brightened. A condo would actually be better than a house. Less maintenance. I hadn't mentioned a condo to her, which meant Mark had. Again. I felt tired more than angry. Diane, I haven't decided anything. Her expression changed. Claire, I don't understand what there is to decide. A lot, but your father left you almost $4 million. There was that number. Apparently Mark had shared that too. That's between me and Dad's estate. I'm not trying to pry. She absolutely was, but I let her continue. I just think you're making decisions while you're grieving. Maybe. Walter made sure you'd never have to worry about money again. I waited. Then she said it. Walter can't use it anymore. What exactly are you saving it for? I looked at her. Diane must have seen something change because she immediately softened her voice. I didn't mean it that way. But there wasn't another way to mean it. Until then, part of me had still thought that if I gave her the condo voluntarily, I could separate my generosity from Mark's arrogance. Sitting there, I understood I couldn't. Not yet. Because Diane wasn't waiting to see whether I wanted to give. She was waiting for me to stop refusing. I think you should keep your current lease, I said. Her face fell. Claire, I haven't submitted anything to the trustee. She stared at me for a moment, picked up her purse, and left. Emily called that night. I'd been expecting it. Mom, what's going on? What did Dad tell you, that he made a stupid decision? That narrows it down. She didn't laugh. He said he retired too early because Grandpa left enough that you guys would be okay. That's one version. He also said you're talking about separate accounts and lawyers. I already have a lawyer. He handles Grandpa's estate. Mom. I heard the frustration in her voice. Then she said the thing I knew someone eventually would. Dad screwed up. I know that. But are you really going to end 22 years over money? That one hurt because it came from my daughter? No. Then what are you doing? I could have told her about the 11-month-old plan. I could have sent it to her before we hung up. Instead I said I'm not asking you to choose between us. I'm not choosing. Good. But I don't understand. I sat down on the edge of my bed. I'm trying to figure out when your father started believing that being married to me meant he didn't have to ask me anymore. Emily went quiet. We ended the call without solving anything. That night, Mark came into the bedroom. We can't keep living like this. No, we can't. If we're married, we build a future together. I agree. Then you can't wall off almost $4 million and act like it has nothing to do with me. I looked at him. You quit your job without asking me. He opened his mouth. I kept going. You promised your mother a house without asking me. You promised your sister $200,000 without asking me. You planned your retirement before Dad died without asking me. Claire, and now I'm supposed to prove I'm committed to this marriage. He had no answer. That was almost worse than another argument. I took my pillow from the bed. Mark watched me. What are you doing? Sleeping in the guest room. For how long I stopped at the door, I don't know. And for once I didn't rush to give him an answer just because he wanted one. Mark moved into the guest room before I could change my mind about taking it. I came home from work the next day and found his clothes hanging in the closet in there, his shaving kit in the bathroom, and a stack of resumes on the desk. Neither of us mentioned it. For the next few weeks our marriage became strangely polite. Do you need anything from Kroger? No thanks, I'm taking the dog out. Okay, I'll be home late. Interview. Good luck. You can live with somebody for 22 years and become courteous strangers remarkably fast. But Mark did start changing things. He canceled the lake property and got the deposit back. He updated his resume. He called former clients and people he'd worked with years ago. I heard him practicing answers before interviews, trying to explain why a man of 55 had abruptly left a perfectly good sales position without saying, "Well, I thought my father-in-law was about to finance my retirement." Most important, he stopped asking about the trust. At first, I assumed it was strategy. Then one Saturday morning, I heard him talking to Melissa. I was in the laundry room folding towels. "No," he said. "You need to work something out with them." A pause. I know what I told you. Another pause. No. Claire didn't change her mind. This isn't about Claire. I stopped folding. Mark's voice got quieter. I shouldn't have promised you that money. I couldn't hear Melissa's answer, but I could imagine it. Then Mark said, I know. A longer pause. But it wasn't mine to promise. My hands went still. That sentence shouldn't have mattered as much as it did. But it was the first time I'd heard him say it. Not the trustee won't approve it, not Claire won't release it, not Walter tied everything up. It wasn't mine. For the first time since Dad died, I wondered if Mark actually understood. A few days later he called his mother. I happened to be making dinner. Mom, listen to me. Don't give notice on your place. I turned the burner down. Even from several feet away I could hear Diane's voice rising through the phone. Mark rubbed the back of his neck. I know what I said. Another burst from Diane. No. Claire didn't stop me. He looked at me. I said nothing. Mark turned toward the window. I promised you something that wasn't mine. There it was again. Diane kept talking. Mark finally said, I know you're disappointed. I'm sorry, but that's on me. When he hung up, neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I said, thank you. He looked surprised. For what? For not making me the villain? He nodded. I did that enough already. That was probably the closest we'd come to tenderness in weeks. And that made what I did next harder. The following Sunday afternoon, I asked him to sit down with me. Not in the den, not in the bedroom, at the kitchen table. The same table where he'd promised his mother a house and his sister $200,000, while Dad's funeral flowers were still sitting in our living room. I put Samuel's folder between us. Mark looked at it. What is that, you tell me? I slid the first page across. He read the title, Hale Bennett Family Investment Plan. His face changed. He didn't ask where I'd gotten it. That told me plenty. You sent this to Dad. Mark leaned back. It was hypothetical. 11 months before he died. Yes. I opened it. Here's your retirement projection. He said nothing. Here's the lake property. Nothing. Here's the money for your mother. I turned another page. And here's $200,000 to $250,000 for Melissa. Claire, I was planning possibilities. For whose money? He rubbed his forehead. We've done this. No, we haven't done this. I pushed the pages toward him. Show me. Show you what? Where you asked what I wanted. He looked at me. Claire. It's 6 pages. It shouldn't take long. He didn't touch them. So I did. I went page by page. My name is here 14 times. I tapped one line. Claire's expected inheritance. Another. Claire's projected assets. Another. Claire's investment income. Then I looked at him. Where am I? He frowned. Your name is everywhere. Exactly. That shut him up. My money is everywhere. I'm nowhere. For a while, all I could hear was the refrigerator humming. Then Mark said I was tired. I waited. I know that's not an excuse. No. He looked down at the papers. I'd been doing the same job forever. Your dad sold his company before 60. He had his house paid off. He could help Emily with college without checking his bank balance first. Dad never held that over you. I know. His answer came so quickly I believed him. That almost made it worse. I hadn't expected that. Mark gave a short, embarrassed laugh. Walter never had to say he was more successful than me. I knew. Mark, no, let me finish. So I did. I wanted to be done worrying about money. And yeah, I wanted to be the guy who could tell my mother she never had to worry about rent again. I wanted to help Melissa. I wanted to be the person everybody called because I could fix things. I watched him. You wanted to feel like my father. He looked away. After a moment he said, maybe. I touched the investment plan. And you were going to use my father's money to do it. Mark closed his eyes. He didn't argue. That was the moment something in me settled. Not because I'd won. I didn't feel victorious. I finally understood what had happened, and understanding it made me sadder, not happier. Mark hadn't spent 11 months plotting to rob me. He'd done something more ordinary. He'd built a story in his head where my inheritance solved every disappointment he had with his own life, and he'd never noticed that I was a person in that story, not an account number. Emily came by later that afternoon. I hadn't invited her for a confrontation. She'd been planning to stop by anyway. The folder was still on the table. She noticed it. "What is that?" I looked at Mark. He nodded once, so I showed her. Emily read quietly for several minutes. Then she looked at her father. "You wrote this before Grandpa died." Mark swallowed. "Yes." "How long before 11 months?" She stared at him. "Dad." There was more disappointment in that one word than I could have produced with an hour of yelling. Mark looked down. "I know." Emily didn't suddenly become my defender. She didn't need to. She just finally understood what she'd been asking me to overlook. After she left, Mark and I sat at the table again. "I'm sorry," he said. I believed he meant it. That was the worst part. If he'd still been arrogant, the decision would have been easy. Instead, he was trying. Maybe genuinely. But Dad hadn't created that trust to tell me whether Mark deserved forgiveness. He'd created time, and I finally knew what I needed to do with some of it. "Dad didn't need to protect me from you with a lawyer," I said. "He just gave me enough time to see what I would have talked myself out of seeing." Mark looked at me. "What are you saying? I need you to move out?" His face went still. "For how long, I don't know. Are you divorcing me?" I shook my head. "I haven't decided." He looked wounded, and I hated that I still cared. But I did. Then I said, "And that's the first big decision in this house nobody else gets to make for me." This time Mark didn't argue. Mark moved out the following Saturday. There was no dramatic scene, no suitcase thrown onto the lawn, no neighbors pretending not to watch through their blinds. He rented a one-bedroom apartment about 15 minutes away and made 3 trips in his SUV. On the last one, he stood in the kitchen with his keys in his hand. "I'll leave the garage remote. You can keep it for now." He nodded. Then neither of us seemed to know what came next. 22 years of marriage and suddenly goodbye felt too formal. "Call me if anything comes up with the house," he said. "I will." He left. I locked the door behind him, then immediately felt guilty for locking it. That's the strange thing about setting a boundary after years of avoiding them. Even when you know why you're doing it, part of you still feels rude. The next few months weren't nearly as satisfying as people imagine these things are. I missed him, not every minute. Some evenings I enjoyed eating exactly what I wanted, and watching television without Mark asking questions halfway through a show he'd claimed he wasn't watching. But I missed hearing his key in the door. I missed his terrible habit of leaving cabinet doors open. I even missed the way he sneezed like somebody had fired a starter pistol in the kitchen. Missing somebody doesn't automatically mean you should go back. That took me a while to understand. Mark found another sales job after about 7 weeks. It paid less than his old one and required more driving. When he told me, I said I'm glad. He gave me a crooked smile. Not exactly the retirement package I had in mind. A few months earlier that would have started a fight. This time he added, "I know. Nobody's fault but mine." Diane stayed in her rental. She renewed for another year after negotiating a smaller increase with the landlord. Melissa took a full-time position with an established design firm and started working through her debts with a repayment plan. Nobody ended up destitute. Nobody lost a home. The catastrophe they had all been preparing me to prevent turned out to be ordinary life. Bills, jobs, rent, the same things everybody else dealt with before Dad died. Mark and I started counseling separately. Later we went together. I won't pretend therapy produced some magical conversation where he said exactly the right thing, and I suddenly understood 22 years of marriage. Mostly it was uncomfortable. One afternoon, our counselor asked Mark why he'd been so certain I would eventually agree to his plans. He sat there for a long time. Then he said, "Because she always came around." I looked at him. "No." He turned toward me. I usually gave in. He started to answer, then stopped. There wasn't much to say. I'd spent years calling that compromise. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. Eventually, Mark apologized without explaining himself afterward. That mattered. He said he was sorry he'd turned Dad's death into a financial event before I'd even had time to grieve. He apologized for making promises on my behalf. He admitted he'd treated my eventual agreement as inevitable. I believed him. I also believed he was changing. But here's something I wish I'd understood when I was younger. Someone becoming better doesn't obligate you to return to the version of yourself who had to be hurt before they changed. After several months, I asked for a legal separation. Later, we began the divorce process. It wasn't vicious. It wasn't painless either. Around that time, Emily and I finally started clearing out Dad's house. I'd avoided it longer than I should have. One Saturday morning, we stood in his kitchen surrounded by cardboard boxes and things that somehow seemed too ridiculous to throw away. Dad owned 4 tape measures. 4. Emily held them up. Was Grandpa expecting a nationwide tape measure shortage? He didn't trust the one in the garage. Wyatt once lied to him. She looked at me. I don't know what that means either. We laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in Dad's house since he died. There was no final secret waiting in a drawer, no dramatic letter we'd somehow missed, just Dad. Hardware store receipts, 3 pairs of reading glasses, an old coffee maker I'd tried to replace twice, measurements scribbled on the back of an envelope for shelves he'd apparently planned to build and never did. Emily was wrapping coffee mugs when she asked, "Do you think Grandpa knew Dad would do all this?" I thought about it. No. She looked surprised. Really, I think he was worried. I folded another box. There's a difference. Dad hadn't known my marriage better than I did. He hadn't set a trap for Mark. He'd noticed something that bothered him and arranged his estate so I wouldn't have to make permanent decisions under pressure. That was all. It turned out to be enough. I didn't do anything exciting with the inheritance. Sorry to disappoint anyone hoping I bought a red convertible and moved to Tuscany. I strengthened my retirement accounts. I worked with Samuel and a financial advisor to make sure my housing was secure after the divorce. Most of the money stayed invested. I created an education fund for any grandchildren I might have someday. And I made a donation to the community college scholarship program Dad had quietly supported for years. Later, I gave Emily some money toward a down payment. But before I did, we sat down and talked about it. How much? Why? What expectations came with it? None, as it happened. That conversation lasted 20 minutes. It may have been the healthiest financial transaction anybody in my family had made all year. The final divorce paperwork took longer than either Mark or I expected. When we met to sign one of the last sets of documents, we got coffee afterward. That probably sounds strange. 22 years doesn't disappear just because lawyers put tabs on things. Mark stirred his coffee for a while. Then he said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd just stayed at work sometimes? We'd probably still be married." I thought about it. Maybe. He looked at me. But the problem would have still been there. What problem? I didn't say it cruelly. You thought being my husband gave you ownership of things that belonged to me. He looked down. I added, "The money just made it expensive enough for me to notice." Mark nodded slowly. I wish I'd noticed first. So did I. We finished our coffee, then we hugged in the parking lot and went to separate cars. For a long time I thought Dad's final gift to me was $3.8 million. It wasn't. The most valuable thing he left me was time, because without that trust, I know what probably would have happened. Mark would have apologized, Diane would have cried, Melissa would have explained how badly she needed the money, and I would have looked at the numbers and told myself there was plenty. I would have given in. Not because I wanted to, because somewhere along the way I'd started confusing keeping everybody happy with being a good wife. 3 days after my father died, my husband quit his job because he thought my inheritance meant neither of us would ever have to work again. He was wrong. Mark went back to work. And in a strange way, so did I. Except the job I finally quit was one I'd been doing for 22 years without realizing it, smoothing things over, giving in, and pretending that keeping the peace was the same thing as being respected. If you've ever had to learn the difference between peace and respect, you probably know why it took me so long. Thanks for listening.